Just to go off on a little bit of a tangent, this is something that always interests me. As a young person, I'm living through these times. I didn't get to live through the Cold War, but you did. Um, what would you say was sort of kind of American pop culture, sort of American sentiment? What did you see as a young person growing up through the Cold War? What was your view of the Soviet Union and communism in terms of like a cultural view?
Okay, well, again, you ask Americans here to get different stories here. There are certain commonalities. Um, I went to Catholic school, and Catholic school was very much anti-communist because of the persecution of Catholics by the communists. And it was and so the image that I had as growing up as a young person was very anti-communist. And the communists were the people who shot priests and nuns. They preached atheism, all of that. So the clarity of the Cold War was certainly there when I was growing up. What complicated it was, of course, the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, I was a young person then. The fact that the United States seemed to be on the wrong side at times in terms of things like the My Lai massacre or some of the things that went on there alienated a lot of us, and we began to think, well, maybe we were wrong about the communists or about the nature of the Cold War. And I think to a certain extent, I went through the complications and the rethinking of the Cold War that went on during the 70s and 80s. In the 70s, particularly, there was this sort of sense that maybe the Cold War is over and we should just deal with the communists as any other power. And then, of course, by the end of the 80s, you had the Afghanistan invasion, you had the Russians really throwing their weight around, and the election of Ronald Reagan, who sort of invoked the sort of old fashioned anti communism. And I remember being in Cambridge then, I was doing my PhD, and everybody was anti Reagan because they thought he was, bringing back this terrible anti communism. But ultimately, by 1988 and 89, Reagan had negotiated these agreements. The Soviet Union was beginning to change, and it looked like maybe they were right. Communism was, and then the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe made, I think, a big impression on me in the sense of seeming to vindicate what had happened in the Cold War. That the Cold War really was about good versus evil. These regimes were not accepted by their people, and they collapsed quickly when that happened. And so I went through different experiences during the Cold War. I do think American popular culture also did, in the sense that when I was growing up, everything was anti Soviet, anti Chinese. Then Vietnam complicated that picture a great deal. The movies, the Vietnam movies of the time, all of that. And then it got back, you had in the Reagan years a sort of return to that. And all of that, I think, is a feature of American culture in general, the ability to sort of go back and forth.
Yeah, I love the manifestation of that in movies. I'm a huge movie nerd. I love movies, and watching the movies of the '80s and seeing sort of the cultural manifestation of that in pop culture. My favorite is Rocky 4. Uh, that's the classic Cold War movie, the best Rocky movie in my opinion. He goes over there and fights the Russian. What's your favorite sort of Cold War movie?
My favorite Cold War movie would probably surprise you. It's The Manchurian Candidate. If you, not the remake, the original Manchurian Candidate is one of my absolute favorites because it really gets at how fearful people were of what the Cold War was doing to our own country. At the same time, the picture of the Russians and the Chinese as these evil manipulators is certainly there too. It's I show it to my students still because of course it evokes McCarthyism, it evokes the Cold War paranoia. There's a whole spying element too, and Frank Sinatra is wonderful in the movie. He's great, and Janet Leigh, and it's a great movie. It also has there's a certain very much a product of its time. It came out the same week as the current Cuban Missile Crisis, and so it was sort of the Cold War at its peak in a certain way.
Yeah, the communist brainwashing and the red scare
Brainwashing,
and all
yes,
that. Yeah.
very much.
That's funny. But going back to Reagan, this is interesting and something that I've been thinking about recently because I do think for the most part Nixon's foreign policy was pretty masterful in terms of kind of the global political chess that he played. But from my you know perspective. I think Nixon was a little bit more conciliatory. Détente with the Soviet Union, the opening of China, and he eased those Cold War tensions, but he didn't end it. And then when you look at Reagan, he was very confrontational towards communism in the Soviet Union. This is an evil empire. This is good versus evil. We win, they lose. It's sort of very different rhetoric, and it was Reagan who ended the Cold War. So, I mean, do you think that more confrontational policy was the better option?
Well, again, look at the Reagan years are an interesting mix because he certainly begins very confrontationally, but that's also when he's building up military forces so to be able to negotiate from a position of strength, because he turns rather conciliatory in his second term, and especially because he gets in Mikhail Gorbachev, he gets a partner, he gets someone that he can really deal with, and Gorbachev's aims. And this is, of course, one of the complicated historical arguments that goes on. Who should get more responsibility for ending the Cold War, Ronald Reagan or Mikhail Gorbachev? Because Gorbachev's reforms of the Soviet Union, the types of things he initiated, ultimately also did lead to the changes that took place, as well as I think, again, you get a combination of both Reagan's policies and Gorbachev's policies in helping to produce the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, that's interesting. It was maybe sort of a perfect storm, but I mean, speaking to that attitude shift in Reagan, I read a book by Annie Jacobson about nuclear war, and she basically breaks down kind of second by second what a realistic modern day nuclear war scenario would look like. But I was listening to her on a podcast, and she was talking about Reagan, and there was this documentary or movie that was released around that time. I forget which news outlet
You're
released
talking
it.
about the ABC television movie The Day After.
Yes, exactly. The day after. Yes, ABC. Um, and she claims that right when that came out and it showed the disastrous effects of nuclear war, Reagan saw that, and then that's what marked his attitude shift. Was he realized that he was very strong on defense spending and a strong military, but after he saw that, he became sort of hesitant about strong military confrontation and nuclear war.
I think that's probably oversimplifying it. The film certainly had an impact on him. If you've seen the film, I've seen it a couple of times. I actually have shown it to my students. I mean, it is a very terrifying scenario of nuclear war and what nuclear war would have meant. And I think Reagan was moved by it, and did work then to try and de-escalate the rhetoric. I mean, Reagan found himself. There's some wonderful points in his diary where he says he can't. He really was surprised to hear the Soviets really believe that he might strike them first nuclear. He had never thought that they could actually believe that the U.S. would engage in such behavior. So he did try. I think he did try in his own way to reassure the Soviets that he wasn't looking to start a nuclear war. And as you probably know, I mean, he was committed in his own mind to abolishing nuclear weapons. And he came very close to doing that with Gorbachev. He thought nuclear weapons should be abolished. And one of the reasons he promoted his Strategic Defense Initiative, which was called Star Wars by its critics, was the idea that if the United States could develop a defensive shield, it would render nuclear weapons pointless.
Yeah, that's it, and that's when he walked out on the negotiations with Gorbachev, I think.
Yeah, in 1986 with
Yeah,
Reykjavik,
yeah.
yes.
Huh.
Yeah.